Jehan Casinader.
Whoa, the frothy one.
Welcome to Between Two Beers.
Thanks for having me. Stoked to be here.
We're very excited to have you in the Export Beer Garden studio this morning. These days, do you prefer to be the interviewer or the interviewee?
Well, I'm a control freak, as I think a lot of journalists are, so we like to be on your side of the table, asking the questions, controlling the conversation. And so I've had to adapt over the last few years as I've started telling my own story and being vulnerable about some of the challenges that I've faced in life. I've had to realize that I actually can't control that. And it's been a really good taste of my own medicine, actually. It's given me an insight into what I have put hundreds of people through over the last 15 years.
With that in mind, you're on the taxi on the way here. Are you scrolling through your mental capacity going, what could they possibly, where might they be going? What are the stories I might need to hit?
I guess when you've been an interviewer or been a journalist for a long time, you're always listening to yourself talking and you're kind of editing as you're talking. So even as I'm speaking now, I'm trying to let go of that little voice in my head that's critiquing me and judging me and going, there's the in point and there's the out point and that was all crap, so they'll get rid of that. So it's really tough, right? It's tough to actually show up in a space like this and be yourself.
Just know we're not going to get rid of any of it. It flows. It's a constant stream of conversation.
I feel like there's a lot going on in your mind at any given time. What's it like in there?
It can be pretty chaotic, but I think, we only know our own minds, right? I don't know what it's like to be in your head. And I don't know what it's like to not wake up in the morning and be thinking about issues and thinking about problems and thinking about who's the next interesting person that I get to meet. But I think over the years, I've chilled out a lot. When I was younger and I was building my career, I was a workaholic. I felt that I needed to prove myself through my work, and that was what was powering my life. And now I think I'm much more comfortable.
We've both been really looking forward to this chat, and there are so many different places we want to go. But a part of it is when you get an expert interviewer talking about kind of the art of the interview. And we saw on LinkedIn about a month ago, you visited Graham Norton. And Graham Norton, I don't know if you know this, is Seamus's, best ever potential guest we could get on. His dream guest.
Well, after I said Joe Rogan first, and I got cancelled almost immediately. I was like, no, I think Graham Norton would be really good.
But I was interested in what you learned. Did you go there to learn about the art of interviewing, or were you just there as a guest?
I was just there in the audience, but the reason that I wanted to go was to see how they put this show together, because he's created a talk show format that has endured for like 15 or 20 years through so many different periods in our culture, and he knocks it out of the park each time. So I think the things that make that show work, first of all, it's the pre-preparation that they do with the guests. They have a whole team of researchers and producers who are trying to draw links between Bradley Cooper and some random stand-up comedian,
James
and Bryan Cranston, and finding what are the things that actually connect these people. And then it's the environment that Graham creates on the set. The set, it doesn't look like a normal TV studio. It looks like a lounge. When the guests came on, when Bradley Cooper and Kerry Mulligan came on, he was sort of moving water glasses around and making sure they had enough space on the sofa. I mean, that's not normal stuff that you see on a talk show. And then as he starts the conversation, trying to connect the guests by saying, oh, you've been to this person's show or you've seen his movie. So already you're starting to actually break down those barriers, and then just creating a really open and supportive environment where he's allowing people to be themselves and asking questions that elicit stories. That's the thing that makes that show. It's not that people come on to plug their movie or their book or whatever, which they do. It's the fact that they're delivering these little nuggets with a beginning, a middle, and an end, a character at the heart of the story. That's the stuff that people love.
I think without knowing it, that has been an inspiration, because I grew up watching those shows, and Graham Norton was a fixture there.
Connect the dots now.
But it's the research and the prep you do to link up the story. We've thought a lot about how we're going to take this interview because that's where the gold is, right?
I think in New Zealand, the word storytelling has kind of become devalued over the last 10 or 15 years because it's become a buzzword. If you talk to businesses, they say, oh, we don't want to sell products anymore. We want to tell stories. We don't want to advertise. We don't want to just ask people for their money. We're storytellers. And that's true to the extent that all of us have a story to tell, right? That's kind of the central idea at the heart of all of my work. But at the same time, storytelling is not necessarily the same thing as creating content. Right now, everyone wants to be a content creator. Everyone's trying to build their personal brand. They're trying to build an audience for themselves on LinkedIn. And you've got all these so-called experts saying, post 3 times a day, pump out all of this stuff because it's an increasingly noisy world. And if you want to capture eyeballs, you have to be seen. But for me, a story is actually not the same thing as a piece of content necessarily. A story has at its heart a central character. It's about a person going on a journey, facing some kind of conflict or obstacles, trying to overcome it, struggling, failing, and inevitably either succeeding or not. And that's the blueprint, that's the template in thousands of books and movies over hundreds and hundreds of years that resonate with us on a human level. Now, not every business story, for example, is nice and tidy and neat like that, but those are the elements in my journalism work that resonate with people. That's the only way that I know how to tell a story, through people.
Yeah, and you've got an incredible story to tell. We both read your book across the last week. I can't speak on behalf of Shay, but I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Shay?
Yeah, I haven't finished it, full disclosure.
Sweet.
I found myself drawing heaps of parallels to your stuff and where you've been through my kind of career working in football administration and finding yourself in hotel rooms and seemingly glamorous worlds. And it was, yeah, man, I said to Steve before this, like, my goal is to, I'm going to pip you here, was to like be mates with you at the end of this because I want to unpack more of that away from the microphone. But yeah, it's a captivating read, particularly for me. Yeah.
Thanks, Seamus.
Yeah, interesting, but also confronting. And there's a lot of chat about your darkest days. And a key theme throughout the book is your friendship with Tommy, who I spoke with yesterday. I had a really good chat with him, and sort of what his support meant to you, how basically he helped keep you alive. It combines 2 areas that we're really invested in this, which is friendship and men's health. And we're going to dig into the relationship with Tommy and all that a little bit later. But as we sit here right now in 2024, how are we doing as men in New Zealand? How's our health?
Not great. I mean, Kiwi men are 3 times more likely than women to die by suicide. We're more likely to die at work. We're more likely to have heart disease. Our life expectancy is 3.5 years shorter than women. I mean, it's a long list. There are all these stats that tell us that men are falling behind when it comes to health in particular areas. And we're not having that conversation because we're afraid of having that conversation. And the reason that we're afraid is because there are long-standing inequities in our society relating to women, relating to Māori and Pacifica, relating to the disabled community, things that are very much overdue for fixing. And we are only just starting to getting around to deal with some of that stuff. And so for many people, I think any conversation where you're saying, hey, what about men? That's not a conversation that we can have. That doesn't seem like something that is okay to even talk about. At the same time, I think many young people are growing up in a world where they're struggling to find their own sense of identity. We hear a lot about toxic masculinity, and we hear all the things that we shouldn't be doing, but we don't talk about healthy masculinity. We're not raising a generation of boys who understand what it actually looks like to be a man in a healthy way in 2024. So we've come a long way, but I think we've got a long way to go as well.
We were having this chat. We listened to you on another podcast, and I think you challenged the interviewer, what does healthy masculinity look like? And Shay, what did you say? You couldn't really think of an example, but then you perhaps stumbled on one?
Yeah, I was like, I couldn't think of the personification of what that looked like for me, like who is a positive, like, male father figure or a great husband. I was like, oh, shit, I can't kind of think of that. And then we kicked around, and we, as a friend group, we have a annual pub crawl, which is less of a pub crawl and more of just the coming together of a group of mates. And we were kicking it around and was like, actually, it's pub 3? Pub 2.
Pub 2.
Pub 2. It's pub 2. So we have an agenda of everything, and pub 2 is the year in review. And you get, everyone's happy and they've caught up, but then you go around the table, each person has an opportunity to speak, and they kind of talk about the year. And it's not the highlights always necessarily. It's some of the struggles that they've had, or it's relationship stuff, or it's we're expecting a child and I'm shitting myself about what that means to become a dad. And I was like, actually, we've got a really good, healthy example of masculinity in our friend group, which was awesome to reflect on.
Is that what you think of when you think of healthy masculinity?
Yeah, I think it's raising a generation of young men who feel confident in who they are, and that will obviously look different for everyone. But what does it look like to be healthy in the area of your friendships? What does it look like to look after your body? What does it look like to be a good father or a good partner? Those are the conversations that I think we need to be having. But it's hard to put your finger on it because we're also deconstructing gender in societal conversations. And so if you were to ask someone really directly, what are the characteristics of a good man? What does a good man look like? What does he do? What are the features of his life? The things that we would have said, 50 years ago, he's strong, he's physically strong, he's dominant, he's a leader. A lot of those things have been called into question because quite rightly, many people have said, well, hang on a second, women can lead, women can innovate, women can run our businesses. And so we've progressed in a really positive way in that sense. But I think that's also created a vacuum for many men because they're struggling to find their own sense of identity.
So when you speak, because you travel around the country and internationally speaking on these themes, what is the message? What do you say?
My key message to anyone is that you're the author of your own story, that you have control over the narrative that you construct for your life. If you don't write your own story, the world will gladly write you one for free. So whether that's as a man, whether that's as a friend, a brother, a leader, whatever hat you might be wearing, if you look to the media for your identity, or you look to social media or your colleagues or your bosses, you're probably going to be presented with a narrative that is not authentic to you and doesn't reflect what's truly important. That's my key message.
Yeah, like jumping on there, there was a passage in there talking about like that narrative of life of go to high school, go to university, get a job, get married, have kids, buy a house, earn enough money by the time you're 65 to retire, buy a set of golf clubs, live happily ever after.
Absolutely.
And I was like reading that going, this is like, I never did any of those things in all of that order. And I found myself for large periods of time being like, oh, what an absolute waste of my life that I've been living. But I was doing all of these things at the same time. It's like really, really profound timing on reading this book. It's incredible.
I just think we haven't, we've raised young people in a culture of mediocrity in New Zealand. And I think a lot of parents, if they're really honest, they don't want their kids to overachieve. They don't want them to underachieve, but they also don't want them to overachieve. They don't want them to take risks. They don't want them to do weird stuff. They don't want them to go into debt. They don't want to bet their career on, some random industry or thing that they're doing in their bed. Certainly a podcast. That wouldn't be top of the list for most parents. And so we have this culture of mediocrity where we want our kids to kind of get merits, maybe a few excellences, but, you don't need to push the boat out too far. Don't mess up the bell curve, be in the middle, graduate, meet these life goals that we've laid out for you, go to uni, get your first job, get into a relationship, buy a house, the white picket fence, have a few nice overseas trips. That's what many parents actually aspire to for their kids because I think that's what they've done, right? They want the same thing for their kids. And that's hugely limiting.
That's generational, right? Like that's our parents, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I'm a parent now, and I think of those things, and perhaps because I'm in the space, that thought of my kid wanting to be a YouTuber or something. I'm like, yeah, I can go for it. That'd be great. But people of our age, as they become parents, is that going to shift?
I think so, but also the world is an increasingly scary place, right? When we were growing up, no one was talking about mental health when I was at high school. We weren't worrying about climate change. We all thought that we would get our first house in our mid-20s for a couple of $100,000. We hadn't been through a pandemic. We didn't have the ongoing trauma of the Christchurch earthquakes and having grown up in that. We weren't worried about world wars. None of that stuff was there. And so I think there will be some parents now in their 20s or 30s who are actually really scared about the future that their kids are going to grow up in and want to almost mollycoddle them or helicopter parent them even more than the previous generation did. So that's a risk.
It's a minefield out there. Mate, this is a strong start. Okay, I'm going to derail us slightly because I want you to tell a story. Storyteller.
Sure.
So we've picked up, I don't know anything about this, Shay's put it in the notes, but tell us about the time you trafficked cocaine from Vancouver to Sydney.
No one has ever asked me that question before. So a few years ago, I was sent to Canada for a travel junket, which is basically when a bunch of journalists from around the world come and do articles about how great the place is. And I was traveling back from Canada. I got back to Wellington very late at night, and my bag came off the carousel, and I could see that the lock was gone. The padlock was gone. And I thought, okay, that's probably a bad sign. When I get to the security people, I'll just mention to them that the lock seems to have been cut off or fallen off or whatever. As I was waiting to get to the security people, I got pulled out of the line for a random bag search, which happens to me, I feel, more often than it should, right, Seamus?
Yeah.
So
Surprised it wasn't in Brisbane or Sydney.
So we go over, the woman opens the bag, says, how's your day been? All good. She's swabbing everything. And she said, I'm just going to put this little card in the machine. I said, oh, it's funny. I actually watched Border Security and Border Patrol and those shows, and that was put in the machine and it goes, whoop, whoop, whoop. That's heroin or that's cocaine. She's like, oh, yeah, it's funny. I watch those shows as well. She goes over and puts the card in the machine and it goes off. And she comes back and says, look, sir, I'm getting a very high reading for cocaine inside this bag. And I said, could I have touched something, like is it some residue? She goes, no.
No,
there is fresh cocaine inside this bag. So she put it through the x-ray machine, and what I think had happened was drugs had been trafficked by baggage handlers or something between Vancouver and Sydney or Sydney and Wellington. And fortunately, they were very good at their job, so they'd managed to remove the parcel before it got to Wellington. So there was no bag of cocaine inside my suitcase, but if there was, then I think I would have been in big trouble.
Did your heart just sink?
Yeah. And then I said to her, I'm actually going to Bali next week. What should I do with this bag? Because I didn't want to be the next Chappelle Corby, right?
Yeah.
And and this is just classic Kiwi response. She goes, I'll just go home and give it a wipe. And I went home and I Googled how to get cocaine residue out of suitcase, which in hindsight
we've all done that.
wasn't the best idea.
Just so you know, we're going to cut that up so it makes it look like you had been trafficking cocaine, and they're going to tease it on the reel.
A few junkets when you were a teenager, right? Because there was a New York Jonas Brothers one around that same time as well.
When I was 18, Disney rang me up and they said, hey, we've got this new young band. It's 3 brothers. They're called the Jonas Brothers, and they've created a made-for-TV movie called Camp Rock, and no one's heard of them before, and we need to get some publicity for this Disney TV movie. Are you interested in going to New York? And I said, I was sitting on the train on the way home from university as a uni student, and I was doing some work for TVNZ, and I said, when is this? And they said, it's in 2 days' time. That's the only thing, but we will fly you business class to New York. We will have a limo pick you up at the Hilton. We'll have a limo pick you up at the airport. We'll take you to the Hilton. You'll stay there for 3 days and you'll interview the Jonas Brothers. So I said, well, I'm going to have to check my schedule, obviously. And I said yes. So I went over for TVNZ to interview the Jonas Brothers, and I was given 2 minutes and 36 seconds with them.
How did you make an impression?
I can't even remember. It was so long ago. But I asked them questions about what they thought about New Zealand and, all that cliche stuff that we love to ask celebrities. And that was my first big overseas junket.
Got to get a New Zealand angle in there.
Right? Yeah.
Okay. I want to go back to the start because we sort of jumped ahead and put you in Jonas Brothers at 18, but there's a lot before that.
In front of Jonas Brothers at 18.
In front of, thank you, Shay. So the drive to get into media at a young age, at 4, you wanted to be on TV, at 10, letters to the editor. Like, what was this childhood? How did this come about?
I grew up in Lower Hutt, and my parents had migrated to New Zealand from Sri Lanka back in the 80s due to a civil war that was happening there. And my dad was a journalist. So I grew up in a household where we were always talking about the news and having big debates around the dinner table, a very socially engaged household. And for me, the TV was this incredible magical box that sat in the corner of the room and took me on these amazing journeys around the world, whether it was current affairs, whether it was news, whether it was watching travel shows or reality TV. I just wanted to be a part of that. And so my parents say that I was 4 years old when I told them that I wanted to be a TV reporter, which is nuts and just shows what a precocious little kid I was. And that's what I wanted to be part of. That's where it started.
Was 6 p.m. news appointment viewing?
Yeah, everybody had to shut up, you know. Yeah. If you were a kid in that household, you had to be quiet for the weather, especially. That was the moment on which everything pivoted, seemingly. And the headlines and what was happening in New Zealand. Yeah.
So continue the storyline and the connection to Holmes. Was Holmes the one that you first sort of made a play at and had a bit of a big break?
Yeah, I contacted the Holmes program when I was 13 years old. And
Is
Lord
that
of the Rings...
old school phone?
Yeah, rang up TVNZ,
Brilliant.
Looked them up in the white pages. No, I mean, there were emails, but, you know, I didn't have anyone's details. No one was online. There was no social media. So I rang them up and harassed them, managed to get through to the producers and said, look, I would like to do a story for you on Lord of the Rings. So I was 13 years old at the time. Paul Holmes was the biggest broadcaster in the country, had an audience of 600,000 or 700,000 people a night. And I had the stubbornness and the naivety and the innocence of a 13-year-old. And I thought, why would they not allow me to do this? And it's really interesting when I look back on that, because I think when you're young, you back yourself to do stuff that you never would as an adult. When I look at the risks that I took as a teenager, the people whose doors I banged on, the emails I sent, the rejections I got, I don't know how I did it in some ways, because now I sit here as a 34-year-old with something to lose. I have a reputation. I have a way that I see myself. I don't want to embarrass myself. But when you're young, you don't have any of that, right? So they allowed me to come in and do this story and go out with a camera crew. Now, how does a 13-year-old know how to put together a TV story? I didn't. But throughout my childhood, I'd grown up not too far from Avalon Studios, which is where TVNZ used to make big game shows and What Now and shows like that. So I dragged my dad along to the studios. In the Hut News, they used to advertise when they needed studio audiences. So during the breaks in filming, I would sneak around the set and I'd grab old copies of scripts and rundowns and I'd take them home and I tried to work out how they actually made TV. So I did this home story and I sat on the carpet at home in Lower Hutt that night, 18th of December, 2003, never forgotten the date, and watched myself on Holmes, and the rest is history.
So he's another constant from my childhood, Paul Holmes, 7 p.m. What did you learn watching him? What was he as inspirational as I imagine he would have been?
Yeah. The thing about Holmes was he shook up the New Zealand television landscape. Before Holmes, the news was very straight. It was black and white. It was reporters in ties talking in a reporter voice, telling you what had happened during the day. Paul Holmes was polarizing. He was controversial. He was colorful. He talked a lot about how broadcasting had taught him that every single person is intelligent. Every single person can articulate themselves if they're given the right opportunity and support to do so. And so that kind of broad brush current affairs, you know, like his tagline at the end of the show, those were our people today, that's Holmes tonight. That was a kind of broadcasting that New Zealand had never seen before. And that's what I grew up with. The whole gamut of politicians being grilled, through to really moving stories on people who'd been through adversity, through to celebrity interviews. That was what appealed to me.
Do you think you could do that Holmes tagline as Paul Holmes?
I wouldn't even try and give it a shot.
Well, we've got some reasonable mail that you do a very good Paul Holmes impression.
A Paul Holmes impression?
I spoke to Tommy and we're going through a bunch of things to talk about. Is there any sort of the quirky stuff about Jehan? He's like, oh, he's very good at accents. I was like, oh, here we go. Which accent specifically? He's like, Paul Holmes. He does very good Paul
Those Holmes. Were our people today. That's Holmes tonight.
It's very, very, very good.
That's the closest you'll get.
Closest. That was bang on. I closed my eyes. I'm back in 2003, December 18th.
Love it. Okay, so continue the storyline. You're kind of on Holmes, but you're a kid.
I'm a kid. I had one day on Holmes, and that was that. So then I went back to high school, right? I'm thinking, well, I don't want to be doing this. I need to be becoming a journalist. So I started writing for Tearaway, which was a youth magazine in high schools. You might remember it.
Big time.
And so I contacted them, and they allowed me to start writing pieces I remember interviewing Michael Murphy, who was the runner-up for New Zealand Idol. This is big news in
He was from
2004. Right, okay.
Yeah.
And so, cool. Burst of passion from Seamus.
It's big news 20 years later still.
And I started doing political reporting. So the 2005 election, I found myself sitting in Prime Minister Helen Clark's office on the 9th floor of the Beehive, interviewing her about policies relating to young people. And so once I started writing for Tearaway, I then had the confidence to start contacting actual newspapers, big newspapers. So I would email the editors at the Herald or the Sunday Star Times from my Hotmail account. I told them that I was a freelance journalist, and I asked them to commission 2,000-word feature articles from me. Now, this was just before social media. So when you Googled someone, you didn't see their whole professional history, which is what you see now. So they started paying me market rates, having no idea that I was a 14, 15, 16-year-old sitting in my bed in Lower Hutt after school. And so I would do things like finding the 04 number for Parliament in the white pages, ringing up Parliament, asking to be put through to government ministers to interview them about different stories that I was writing about. And I remember the first time I came home from school and I read the Hansard, which is this transcript of what happens in Parliament in the debating chamber. And I saw that a minister was holding up my article from the weekend. Now, this is like the nerdiest story I could possibly tell you, but it was the most exciting thing at the time. And that's how I got into journalism. I'm not qualified as a journalist, even now.
No.
Really?
No.
So who's helping you? Are you getting someone to help you edit the copy you're sending through? Do you have a small circle that are looking over what you're doing?
The only person that I asked for help from was my dad, who was a journalist and had worked as a journalist for 20 or 30 years overseas before moving to New Zealand. And he actually worked as a sub-editor at the Dominion when I was growing up. He had actually said to me, look, I really don't think you should be doing this. This is not a secure career path. You shouldn't be chasing this. The media is a really tough industry. And my parents were really worried that I was neglecting my schoolwork because I was too busy chasing after Michael Murphy and Helen Clark and everybody else. But my dad helped me a little bit.
Were you doing well at school at the same time in parallel?
Yeah, I was doing pretty well at school, but I never saw myself as academic. I was much more interested in skiving off and going and borrowing the school video camera to make little documentaries and things like that.
You know how you talk about in your formative years, oblivious to getting told no. When you are sitting on the 9th floor of the Beehive with Helen Clark at age 14, 15, are you having those moments where you're like, this is pretty incredible? Or are you just like fixated on trying to nail the story?
Do you know that I didn't have that moment when I was 15 sitting in that office with Helen Clark, but I did have it last year when I was sitting in the same office with Jacinda Ardern. And I was doing an interview with her for the Sunday program off the back of all the COVID stuff. And we had a lot of access and we had a lot of time to go in there. Like I was standing in her office and she wasn't even there. She hadn't arrived for work yet. And we were just setting up. And it was just a quiet little moment where I'm like, hang on a second, how did I get here? How did I, as a little brown kid growing up in Lower Hutt, end up standing in the Prime Minister's office waiting to interview her? And that's still a question that I haven't found the answer to.
That's amazing that it's taken, you're 34?
Yep.
Yeah. Wow. Some serious growth going on maybe over the last few years. Is that
Yeah, I think it's just, you reflect on the totality of your life experience as you get older. And when you're younger, you're just doing it. Like for many, many years, I was just on the treadmill, building, hustling. What's the next thing? What's the next show? What's the next story? What's the next job opportunity? But I think it's only when I stepped away from media and working in that pace and environment that I was able to go, wow, you're actually a million miles away from where you started and you got so much of what you wanted. And I guess learning to be proud of that and learning to actually be satisfied and comfortable with what I've achieved rather than feeling like it's only going to be good enough if I get to the next stage.
Do you have more of those moments? Have you built on that moment on the 9th floor now in your everyday life or in your week-to-week life?
Yeah, I mean, my lifestyle looks very different now because I've stepped out of that treadmill of full-time journalism, but I'm definitely more grateful than I was for the experiences that I had as a journalist. Yeah.
Continuing along, 17, you're on Breakfast TV, huge audience. that's a pretty important year of high school.
Yes.
What's your profile like around your friends and teachers? Are you seen as like the star kid?
No, I don't think so. I felt very different at school. I didn't feel that I fitted in. I mean, I had my mates, but I definitely wasn't one of the cool kids at all. And any social capital that I thought I would get from being on breakfast TV first thing in the morning didn't really materialize. But it was weird. It was weird getting up at 5:30 in the morning, taking the train into Wellington, being on air with Paul Henry, and then going back to the railway station and taking the train out to Upper Hutt, walking in the school gates just before the first period of the day, and people talking about what I'd said on TV that morning.
Yeah.
It was super weird, but it was awesome.
That is surreal. So, and then the next sort of decade, you're in the journalism scene, and you talk about this fast pace, so many different adventures and stories and things to cover. What effect does that have on you? Two questions to take whichever way you want. One of it is, how do you know you're doing a good job? Like, are you driven to attract big audiences in these shows? And then is there stress involved in that in the bigger picture? How does stress play a part in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've only worked in commercial media. In other words, media that are designed to get a big audience and make a profit. I think a lot of people in New Zealand think that media organisations are like charities or government departments and that they just exist for the good of the public. And obviously public interest journalism is a huge part of why media exists, but ultimately they're owned by people who want to make a return. They're owned by people who need their investment to be recouped in some ways. So I was working for TVNZ, which is a state-owned organisation, but is owned by the taxpayer and is meant to pay a dividend to the government, which I think a lot of people don't know. So advertising is really important. Ratings are important. So every day the ratings came in when I was working on Close Up or 7 Sharp, and I would feel physically anxious when I went to work in the morning if I'd had the lead story the night before, because everyone is sitting there refreshing their emails to find out, how did we do against Campbell Live, against Married at First Sight, against The Block, against The Bachelor. We had a heavy-hitting story. We had an investigation. We had something that was quite a challenging watch. Did we win or did we lose? Now that causes a huge amount of pressure. Competition is awesome. I loved competing as a journalist, trying to see whether I could get the story first or get the exclusive, but it was also hugely stressful. And some of that stress was the stress that I put on myself because I set really high standards for myself. I was traveling every week. I wanted to have the lead story. I wanted to be avoiding the fluffy stories at the end of the show. And so I just hustled. And that takes a toll on your body. You're relying on caffeine and sugar during the day. When you're working on a 7 o'clock show, the weird thing is that your deadline is at the end of the day. So most people lose energy across the day. They come in the morning and they lose their energy by the time they leave. But if you've got a live cross at 7 o'clock at night, and you know that you're going to be in front of 500,000 people and a story is developing as you're creating it, that's hard. There were times where the opening titles would be playing and the story wasn't there.
Wow.
And I would be running in between the edit suite and the Wellington control room, and you can hear the Auckland control room where the studio is yelling down the line to the operator saying, where is the story? And I'm watching Mark Sainsbury or Mike Hosking or whoever it was saying, well, first up tonight, an investigation into XYZ, or Jehan Casinader got on a plane today and went to wherever, and they're refreshing, and it's not there. And at the last second, it pops up in the server, and someone in Auckland says, roll it, and someone presses a button. And in that moment, 500,000 people are watching the thing you made that didn't exist 6 hours earlier. That's a rush.
Yeah, that is
It's
a rush.
a huge rush.
What's the emotional aftermath of that?
You come out of, it's like coming out of a fog, you know? Often I would start the day having no idea where I was going to be that night. I remember one morning, my first job of the day was to go on the Herald and stuff and see what was happening and what was in the papers and what had broken, because we then had 10 hours or whatever to get a perspective on that for 7 o'clock. And not a 1.5 minute news story. We were expected to have a 4 or 5 minute story that went in depth, often interviewed multiple people, maybe had a live interview with a politician or something off the back of that. I mean, we don't do that kind of TV anymore in New Zealand, but that was the norm for like 20 years. So, okay, open the paper this morning. Right, in the Newtown flats in Wellington, there's a pensioner whose body has been found and it's been decaying there for like a year. It's my job to go down there now, before Campbell Live gets down there, and start knocking on doors and asking people to tell me what's been going on. I get a phone call in the morning. I come into work. Actually, I remember one morning I was having a cup of Earl Grey tea in bed, and it was a totally normal day. I came into work, and that night I was going to sleep inside Gloriavale on the West Coast.
Okay, we're going to need to dig into this one. Yeah, I did want to talk about this, because something like that comes across your desk and you're like, okay, yeah, we're going to Gloriavale for a night. Is that how it... Take us to Gloriavale.
There was a lot of media coverage about Gloriavale back in 2015. There were complaints. There was speculation about what was actually happening there, whether there was abuse, whether it was a cult, whether there were things that were being covered up, and no one had really been in there. There were some documentary makers that had been allowed in there, but the suspicion was fairly controlled access. We don't really know what's going on there. But it sort of reached fever pitch, and I went into work one day and I was told, look, we need to get you down there and you need to try and get in. And the reason that we needed to try and get in was that other media were running all these stories about Gloriavale and we had nothing at that point. And I said, I'm not, this just seems like a hospital pass. Like I'm not flying down. What do you think they're going to do? Roll out the red carpet and say, yes, please come into our commune and eat from our table and we'll, give you a tour. That's not how this is going to go down. And I was told, no, this is what we're going to do. Well, but there's no flights to the West Coast from Wellington. Well, we'll get you down there. We'll fly you to Hokitika or something, and then you can, drive, or we'll fly you to Christchurch. So I can't even remember how. I think we went to Christchurch, and then we drove through Arthur's Pass to Glory. We're turning up. It's like now dusk, right?
In a suit?
In my suit. Yeah, this is in the days where
this was on brand for you.
It was on brand. Yeah, I loved the suit. Yeah. And when 7 Sharp started, we were told, look, you don't need to wear suits anymore. I said, no, I'm hanging on to the suit, right? Yeah. This is the last vestige of my credibility as a reporter. Yeah. So I turn up in my Barker's suit at Gloriavale, walk down this gravel driveway, and it's nearly nightfall. And I start talking to the elders there and saying, look, this is who we are. And my pitch to them was basically, we just want to show, New Zealand is talking about you right now. We want to show people what day-to-day life actually is like inside here. And they were obviously very suspicious of us. And they said, look, we've got to get the 12 elders to sit around in a circle and talk to you and hear why you're here. So it's now like mid-evening. And I think the conversations basically went on so long that they were like, well, we can't send you away now because it's dark. And I think that's the only reason that they allowed us to stay. So we had dinner with Hopeful Christian, who's the man who founded Gloriavale. And there were articles on the walls about the dangers of technology and just, what we would now describe as sort of conspiracy theory type pieces about just weird stuff that wasn't correct. And so that was an insight into how controlled everything was in there.
What did you have to eat?
I can't remember. Oh. Yeah, I had bigger things to worry about.
Did you have any dietary requirements?
No, I didn't say, hey, I'm gluten-free, actually. And so I was taken to this room with a four-poster bed on the same floor that many of the other families were sleeping in. I was given a little box of herbal teas because there's no caffeine allowed in Gloriavale. And I tried to sleep going, this is just completely wild. We couldn't communicate with our bosses because there was no cell phone reception there. And so they had no idea where we were. And the next morning we woke up, spent the whole day filming a story and left in the evening. And when we got into cell phone reception, I rang TVNZ and they said, look, we just thought there were a few different scenarios here. My producer said, either you are in Gloriavale and everything's fine, or you're in Gloriavale and you're dead, or you're dead and you're somewhere else. And I said, no, we're actually completely fine. We've got a great story. And we then drove to Christchurch, jumped on the last flight back to Wellington, recorded a promo on the road, literally on the side of the road, Someone came and grabbed the tape off us at Christchurch Airport. They played it that night. I stayed up the whole night basically writing the script, and we put a story out the next night.
And how many people would have watched that?
Probably 600,000 at that point.
Wow.
Did you get any sleep that night at Gloriavale? Like, is it
Not
such
really.
a surreal?
It's a surreal environment. And I found it a really interesting story to cover because there were very strong opinions around that, right? Because the allegations that were being made were very serious, and we were never going to uncover whatever there was to be uncovered on that trip. You know, we're there as guests. And so it was a tricky one to try and navigate. How do we tell this story in a way that's fair? And how do we actually give the people of Gloriavale an opportunity to show what life is like there, but also we don't want to legitimize anything that's going on there that is wrong or bad. And it's taken many, many years, actually, for the truth to come out.
Yeah, this starts to get us into the art of the interview. And I'm interested how you have empathy for people who you dislike, who these, really despicable people in some regards. How do you approach that?
Well, I think it's respecting people's life experience. And if I sit down with someone for a conversation, I don't need their opinion, their worldview to perfectly line up with mine. And I think that's one of the main things that we're struggling with in our culture at the moment, is that we want other people to be on exactly the same page as us. And if their views and their life experience don't line up with ours, then we're not really interested in having anything to do with them. And so if I'm sitting down with the leader of a religious sect, if I'm sitting down with a murderer, if I'm sitting down with a politician, even if I'm sitting down with a sports person who's won gold at the Olympics, I recognize that there is light and shade in each of those people. The people that we vilify, the people that we criticize also have good in them. And the people that we hold up as role models and examples and people that we should aspire to be like also have the capacity to do terrible things. And so I think if you can see people as combining both the good and the bad, the light and the shade, it makes it much easier to do your job as an interviewer.
How did you hone that worldview?
Well, I think it's probably the product of my upbringing, growing up in a family that was very sort of social justice focused, growing up in a family that was built around the Christian faith and the idea that every single person has inherent value. And I think that's what influenced the way that I started my journalism career. I wanted to understand people. I wanted to understand their motivations. I wanted to understand, their quirks, the things that made them strong, the things that made them weak, and how they overcame difficult times. That's probably been the theme through all of my storytelling.
Was your perspective unique in the newsroom amongst your peers?
I don't think so. I mean, I've worked with lots of amazing storytellers who, I've learned so much from in terms of how they look after people through the process of telling a story. It's not an easy thing to do for anyone to go on national TV and talk about the toughest stuff that they've experienced in their life. But at the same time, it's really tough because you know that you're trying to deliver a story that people will watch. So the tension is constantly, how do I tell the truest, most accurate, most fair version of the story, but also make sure that it's compelling enough that people want to tune in and see it. And that's not a perfect balance a lot of the time.
There's been a lot of tragedy and death across the things you've covered across 15 years. Have you learned anything in particular from that round?
I've learned how fragile life is. And, it's interesting to me that we often wait until the car crash or the cancer diagnosis to take stock of our lives and to realize how much we actually have to be grateful for. I've had hundreds of conversations with grieving parents, grieving loved ones, people who have lost their child to suicide, to a boy racing accident, to, I remember doing a story once about a 14 or 15-year-old who'd been drinking for the first time with his siblings and had gone to bed, threw up in his sleep and never woke up. And they were living in a farmhouse. They were on a farm in the Wairarapa. And I saw this little article in the local paper and I thought, there's a story here. Now that's, like, a lot of people would be like, what are you talking about? Why would you want to go and intrude on that grief? Why would you even want to be in that room? But I figured that when a child dies in such a senseless, tragic way, there have got to be lessons from that, right? There've got to be life lessons. There's got to be something that we can use to enlighten people. And so I rang up the family and they said, yeah, come around. And the cameraman said to me, I really don't want to do this. Why are we doing this? And I said, look, just trust me. There will be a story here that will be sensitively and respectfully told. So we turn up at this house and we go into this kid's bedroom, and this 14-year-old is lying there in the casket in his bedroom, and there's music blaring and his teenage friends are sitting around the casket telling stories. Those are the rooms that I have found myself in over and over and over again. And again, I ask myself, why me? What am I doing here? I'm an observer. I don't have skin in the game. I'm not a police officer or an ambulance officer. I don't have any practical role, but I'm simply here to listen and to capture the story and to give people the opportunity to talk and then share that with the rest of the country, hopefully in a way that's not gratuitous or sensational, but a way that actually allows them to learn something. And in that story, one of his friends was talking about how precious life is and how short it is and how fragile it is and all of those types of things. And I was sitting at my computer after that story went to air, and an email came in from someone who said, I've actually been estranged from my brother for 10 years, but watching the story has made me realize that I actually just need to pick up the phone and give him a call and mend that bridge. That's the stuff to me that makes it all worth it. You know, a lot of the stories that I've done over the years, they're not the big headline making stories. They're not the ones that necessarily trigger investigations and government inquiries and stuff. And I used to think when I was younger, that was proper journalism. That was the stuff that I needed to aspire to do. But as I got older, I realized actually the biggest impact that I can have is if I can tell stories that cause the audience to shift their view of themselves or the world just a little bit. So often parents would write to the Sunday program and say, you know, after watching a story about what this family went through, I turned off the TV and I walked into my kids' bedroom while they were sleeping and I gave them an extra hug or an extra kiss. And that's the magic of TV, that when you're exposed to someone else's story and you get taken on that journey, it changes the way you see yourself.
That's the magic of the space we're operating into.
Yeah.
We just released a podcast with Lauren Ray, which will be, by the time this goes out, a little bit dated. But the perspective shift that it has on so many people and the feedback and them writing in and saying someone went through a similar journey, like it was so cool to hear a story and change. You know, it feels like you're doing meaningful work.
So isn't the crazy thing then that so many Kiwis are reluctant to tell their own stories?
Yeah, I don't have anything to say.
I don't have anything to say. I don't know how to say it in the right way. I'm worried that I'll be judged. I'm worried that people think that I'm weak. I'm worried that it'll have repercussions for my career. So many reservations, right? And so we just shut up and we think, well, other people have the platform, other people have the microphone. I'm not worthy of that. And so your best stuff, the gold that you've learnt, never actually gets to help people. And I think it's a real problem in our country.
Yeah, are Kiwis different to Aussies, to Americans,
I think
to Islanders in this regard?
Definitely compared to even Aussies, even though we like to think that we have a very similar culture to Australia. My experience, having done a lot of reporting in Australia, is that it is different. Aussies are more confident. They're more likely to have a yarn. They have a drier sense of humor in some ways. They can talk about stuff in a way that I think we find really uncomfortable. And then Americans are kind of on the other end of the spectrum. Like you go over to America, like the interviews were sometimes 10 or 12 minutes because they would just give you soundbite after soundbite after soundbite. And it was amazing. So I think we have a way to go.
You spoke before about light and shade. So you get incredible uplifting emails about the work that you do. But you also probably, I would imagine, because we do this as well, you take on some of the emotional baggage from the people that you're speaking to. Were you able to process that yourself, or did that start to seep into your person?
Yeah, it sticks to you, right? Other people's trauma sticks to you. You can't walk away from sitting in someone's house while they're telling you about the worst day of their life and just go home and turn on the TV and carry on with your evening. I would try and debrief on stuff with producers and camera crews when we were on the road. That was often the best way to do it. But none of us really had training at that point around vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, or the idea that, you're being exposed to stuff that could be really damaging to you. And that's the weird thing about journalism, is like, just like paramedics and police officers, we are running towards the tragedy or the disaster that everyone else is running away from. But I think because we don't have that active role, for many years it was kind of like, well, yeah, but you weren't involved. Like, it kind of affected you that much. You weren't actually doing anything. You were just there filming and talking to people. So I think that's caused a lot of journalists to become hardened, They drink. They just sort of bottle it all up. It's, classic stuff that many Kiwis have done for many, many years, right? We just don't talk about it, and then it sort of starts to eat you up.
On the other side of this death and tragedy and heavy stuff, you've had the opportunity to sit with some incredible leaders and inspirational people. I think you've interviewed 5 Kiwi prime ministers.
The last 5, yeah.
The last 5. What have you learned from that?
That you have to be a particular kind of person to do that job. I remember an interview that Jacinda Ardern did when she was deputy leader of Labour, or maybe even before that. She talked about how she never wanted to be the Prime Minister because it's just not the kind of job that was right for her. She talked about her experience with anxiety, and she just pretty much said that this job wouldn't work for me. And this was in the lead up to an election when Andrew Little was still the leader. No one was ever contemplating that he would step aside and she would end up being the Labour leader who took the party into the election, right? And she has never talked about that stuff subsequently in any kind of detail. And I suspect she possibly regretted doing that interview and being that honest, because in some ways it was then weaponized against her, particularly as a woman. It's kind of like, well, can you really not hack the job? But, a lot of political leaders go through stuff that most people have absolutely no idea about. I mean, for starters, most politicians sleep only 3 or 4 hours a night. Certainly politicians who are ministers or are in those senior positions. They give up their privacy. They give up the time with their family and their kids. They're exposed to briefings and are in a position where they have to make decisions that never even make the papers, particularly stuff around security and things that we never hear about. And so I always find it kind of funny when I hear people talking about the baubles of office, or the fact that they get to use corporate cabs, or, get to stay in nice hotels or whatever. That is not the reality of the job. They give up so much to do that. And so, having interviewed people on both sides of the spectrum, of the political spectrum, any of them could go and make tons of money, as some of them have previously, and have a very cushy, nice life. So then the question is, well, why do they do it? What is it that actually makes them tick? And as with anyone, it's a combination of factors. They want to make a difference, but there's also some ego in there. There's a desire to perform. There's a desire to achieve. There's a desire to leave their mark on New Zealand and leave a legacy. And they all have different ways of doing it. But I'd like to think that most politicians go into that place because they do want to make New Zealand better. And I think we need to be better at acknowledging that, okay, just because someone has a different political outlook to me, that doesn't mean that their motivations are not the same as mine.
How many of those 5 are in your phone that you're still regularly in comms with?
There's none that I'm regularly in comms with, but there are a couple on the phone.
A couple on the phone. Yeah. This has been flying. So there is a major part of your story which we haven't touched on yet, and like I spoke to at the start, it's your book, and it's incredibly open about the major struggles, and I'm talking about suicide and suicidal thoughts and how you pulled through with it. I had a really good chat with your mate Tommy about his side of it, what I want to get to, but can you talk about that part of your story and how it interweaves with everything we've spoken about, and where you want to go with it?
So I specialized in mental health reporting and social issues reporting. So I saw myself as the kind of person that did stories about people who were struggling mentally. And the first story that I did was a piece that I wrote for the Herald at the age of 16 after I went to a funeral for a classmate who'd ended his life during the summer holidays. And we walked into this funeral, and I will never forget, Justin Timberlake and the Black Eyed Peas were playing over the speakers. And I remember that feeling so wrong. Even as a 16-year-old, I knew that that wasn't right. Why are we here? Why are we in this room? Why is he in that casket? Why are we listening to this music in this church? And so I ended up writing a piece about suicide. This is 2006. No one is talking about suicide, right? No one is talking about suicide. And I'm just starting my journalism career. I'm still at high school, but I was really interested in this topic because I could tell that it was affecting a lot of people, and the stats told us that. And around that time, Sir John Kirwan had started talking about depression. The government was funding this big ad campaign to get people to talk about mental health. That was spearheaded by Jim Anderton, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, and he'd actually lost a child to suicide. And so that's why he was really personally invested in putting millions of dollars of government money into talking about this issue. So then I get into my journalism career and I spend many years telling these kinds of stories. And I would often go home at the end of the day and think, I'm so glad that that's not me. You know, there was almost a bit of smugness about it. Like, I'm so sorry that that person's gone through that, but I'm glad that I'm mentally robust. And then everything changed at the age of 26 when I moved to Auckland to take on a new job on the Sunday program. I was working with people who had been long-form investigative current affairs reporters for like 30 years, and I was dropped into that team, very green, very young. So it was a pretty high-pressure environment. I was doing really challenging stories, and I was carrying people through this very vulnerable process of going on TV, talking about bulimia, suicide, stillbirth, meth addiction. You know, it was kind of unrelentingly grim and full-on all the time. And at the same time, I was struggling to find my own place in Auckland. I'd left behind my friends, my family, my flat, all the stuff that was holding my life together. And I realized that I was lost, really. And so what I did was to use all the tools in the mental health toolbox that I had been telling people to use through my storytelling, which is go and see a counselor, try antidepressants if that might work, cut back on alcohol, improve your diet, improve your sleep, improve your social connection, cut back your stress. So I did all of that stuff. And I think it's really interesting because we always say to people, ask for help, right? Ask for help, ask for help, ask for help. That's the drum that we constantly bang on. But what happens when the help isn't there? What happens when you actually do all the stuff that you've been told to do? You use all the tools, you follow all the influences, you read all the books, and you're still not getting better. And what I found was that my mental health was actually continuing to deteriorate. I realized that I was depressed. I then realized that I was suicidal. I was having, through the worst period of this, unrelenting suicidal thoughts on a daily basis. But I was still performing at a really high level. I think there's still a real misconception around what it looks like to be depressed or suicidal. As if you walk into the office, slouched over, media often use these photos for mental health stories, like a stock image with a guy with his head in his hands, silhouetted against a window or something. And that's not what it looks like for a lot of us. I was working at TVNZ when the newsreader Greg Boyd ended his life. And that was a real shock, not just for those of us who had worked with Greg, but also for the country at large. Because they said, hang on a second, this guy was a newsreader, right? He was on TV. He had a suit and tie on every day. He looked really friendly. He communicated really well. He looked confident. But it wasn't the whole story. And that really frustrated me at the time because I thought, well, we haven't learned as much as we think we've learned when it comes to mental health. How someone presents actually tells you nothing about what's going on the inside, right? So I put on the mask each day and I continued to perform and I was winning journalism awards and I was meeting all of my obligations, but life was really crumbling for me on the inside. And I think, with the benefit of hindsight, when I look back, what I was struggling with was kind of a deep self-loathing. I didn't like myself. I had grown up as a kid who had learnt to earn other people's attention and affection through my work, through performing, through what I was producing. And that was a strategy that helped a very shy, insecure kid growing up in Lower Hutt to get by, but it was a really poor strategy for an adult to be functioning with.
One of the nights you speak about in the book is winning Reporter of the Year.
Yes.
And you talk about how it was sort of at your lowest moment at the same time. Can you talk to us about that night?
Yeah, so I had been nominated for Reporter of the Year at the New Zealand TV Awards, and that to me was like the pinnacle. It was like the Oscars, right? It was like, first of all, I can't believe I'm even a finalist for this. And if I win that, I will be off the charts happy. That will be like career goals all ticked off. I can retire at 28. And so we all got dressed up, and it's a big deal, and there's all these presenters and, people who I was still kind of intimidated by even at that age, like, you're walking around the TVNZ newsroom and someone like Simon Dallow walks past and it's just like, I grew up watching you on TV, like, this is amazing. So I got in this cab with Wendy Petrie and Hayley Holt, and everyone's dressed up, and we take the cab like 30 seconds down the road from TVNZ to the Civic and get out and have photos on the red carpet and all the rest of it. And the publicist was saying to me, oh, look, have you got your speech ready in case you win? And I said, no, I haven't written anything because I know that I'm not going to win. And people kept saying to me, where's your speech? Like, you make sure that you've got a speech, right? And I started to go, maybe, do these people, have they got embargoed results? Do they know something that I haven't got? Yeah. And so I said to the publicist as we were walking out, I said, look, can you just, because I'm super nervous, can you just tell me, have I won or have I not won? And she was like, do you actually want to know? And I said, yes. And she said, yep, you've won. So I walked into the auditorium and I sat there as all these other awards were presented, knowing that I was going to win this, and my heart was racing. So I got up onto the stage. It was, this very intense moment. You come off the stage, someone gives you a glass of champagne, they're taking pictures of you. It was an amazing night. And I went home, and I remember waking up the next morning, and the little plinth was sitting on my bedside table. And what I'd expected to feel was like $1 million, right? And instead what I felt was, first of all, how on earth am I going to achieve this next year? That was honestly my first thought. Like, this wave of panic that I now need to earn my status again, now that I've proven that I'm at this level. And the second thing was just a deep sense of emptiness and loneliness. And I was looking at this thing thinking, I've worked so hard for this, but actually, what's the point? And it almost took me back to, I told you the story of the Jonas brothers trip when I was 18. I remember turning up in New York in the limo at the Hilton, go to bed, wake up the next morning and open the curtains, and there's Manhattan. And my first thought there was, I wish there was someone to share this with. Anybody that I could share this moment with. And I think the thing that I've learned about myself is that, I really value sharing experiences with other people. I think the best things in life are shared. And a lot of the experiences that I've had over the years, even though I've been making TV with other people, there has been a loneliness through that. And so that's something that I struggled with. And I think it contributed to my mental health challenges.
It's wild because I went in a deep dive of your Instagram last night, and I saw that photo of the three of you in the cab. I didn't realize, I didn't make the connection that was the same night. And it's crazy how on LinkedIn as well, I think there's a photo of you and Zach Guilford during the Inside Word where this is not what depression or looks like. And those fronts that you put up for the rest of the world to see are the how you present, that's resonating around kind of in my head at the moment.
And that's not unique to me, right? A lot of people do that, and it's how we survive. It's how we get through. I think, there's this weird misconception that if you're going through really significant mental health challenges, you should be lying in bed, you should not be at work, you should be staring at the roof and meditating or something like that. And actually, for me, the best thing was to be at work. Work gave me structure. It gave me routine. It gave me connection to other people. So those things were all really positive. But at the same time, my work was so challenging and so demanding that it was also that lifestyle, being trapped in that lifestyle of this is feeding me and it's giving me worth and it's making me feel like I'm doing something, but also I'm just going round and round in circles. I'm stuck in Auckland. I'm not breaking out of this mental rut. Something's not working here. There needs to be a circuit breaker.
So in the book, you write about you reach this point where you actually reach out to your friend group, and you say, I'm being open and honest with you guys. I'm suicidal. I'm struggling. I don't know what to do. I need some help.
Yeah.
And what a thing to do in the first instance. But only one of those group really sort of stood up and helped you in the way that you needed, and that was Tommy. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's really complicated because everybody wanted to help and everybody tried to help in their own way. And it's taken a few years for me to wrap my head around the fact that often people do the best that they can with what they have. And if they haven't been through mental health challenges, or they haven't grown or developed in some areas of their life, they don't know how to do friendship in this kind of season, then they're not going to show up in the way that you need them to. And I think it can both be having empathy for them and their lack of ability to show up in the way that they want, and also recognizing that in some cases people just couldn't be bothered and didn't prioritize supporting me in the way that I would have liked. So there's a whole different, range of factors at play there. But, I had a number of friends who did try to support me, but the person that was the most consistent out of those was Tommy.
So in speaking with him, it's so, I really recommend go and read the book. It's a great read. And these texts that you exchange between the both of you are really confronting and really real. And it's you basically say, I don't know if I can hold on. Like, I think this is it. And him replying in the best way he could. And I asked him what his perspective was reading that, because that's your version of events, but what his version was. So this is what Tommy said. When the book was written, it was really beautiful to see how people responded to the friendship dynamic. It painted me in a really nice light, but it didn't give me the opportunity to share how amazing he has been. I wouldn't be who I am without Jehan. He's been such an incredible support to me through everything I've been through. He's so incredibly selfless. He remained an incredible friend. Just because he was having a bad day or feeling suicidal, he never let that get in the way of helping me. So much of my life has been shaped by that friendship. Every aspect of my life has been impacted by him. He means the world to me. I'm just so proud of him, what he's achieved and what he's doing. And this was an emotional call on both of our ends, because it's perhaps not often you reflect on a friendship like that. But that I thought it was important for you to know. I'm not sure what sort of combos you have, for you to know how much you helped him as well. Yeah, what do you, when you hear those words, what do you think?
Yeah, it's pretty moving. I mean, we've been friends for 14 years, and it's been the biggest blessing in my life having Tommy there as someone who's constantly supporting me and cheering me on. And where that friendship came from was so unlikely. I was 20. I was starting my journalism career. I'd spoken at a Young Leaders Day for high school students. And Tommy was finishing high school. He sent me this email, again via Hotmail, and said that he was worried about school lockdowns, and that he was worried about whether his school was prepared for a lockdown. Was there going to be a lockdown? And was his school ready for a gunman walking out? What is all of this about? And so I started talking to him about this, and I ended up doing a Sunday Star Times article about lockdowns in schools. And we ended up staying in touch. And the thing that struck me in his original email was when he said, this is an issue that's really close to my heart. I thought, that's really unusual language. That's not the language that, a 17-year-old guy uses normally. And he ended up moving to Wellington, and we stayed in touch and became really great mates, and have talked every day for the last 14 years, pretty much.
And
in some form.
How important is that friendship?
Majorly important. I mean, I wouldn't be who I was without it, and it's really nice that he feels the same. But we just ignore most of those conventions around what friendship is supposed to look like for guys in New Zealand, which I think, for most people involves going to the pub or doing stuff or being active or, going for a run or a walk. Or we do all of that stuff, but we also are not afraid to have conversations with each other, like actual conversations. And I would describe what we have as a friendship, whereas I think a lot of the times, we talk about being mates, but being a mate is not necessarily the same thing as being a friend. Like being a mate, the term almost leaves a sense of distance, We're close and we know each other and we get on and we're in each other's lives. But friend almost seems a little bit uncomfortable for guys, like it's a little bit too vulnerable. But it's in that space that the magic actually happens, and you get to know someone inside out. You get to know their flaws, what makes them great, what their potential is.
So this is happening over years.
Yeah.
How do you come out of it? Are you out of it?
Out of my experience of depression?
And suicidal
thoughts? Yes, I am. But I also think that, as cliche as this sounds, recovery is a journey, not a destination. I think when we tell mental health stories, so often we tell them like person falls in hole, they hit what we call rock bottom, and then they climb out the other side, and then life's supposed to be great. And it's a nice, neat U-shaped line. But the reality is, for a lot of us, it's a squiggly line. It's messy. There's ups, there's downs. You learn something, you regress, you go back, you fall into old habits. Your self-talk's really bad. So I've kind of ridden that wave over the last few years. But now I'm in a really healthy place. I think I'm the strongest that I've ever been, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. So I'm really grateful for that. But I also think that when people like me come and sit on podcasts like this and say, it was really bad and now life's amazing, that's good, because it can give people hope and it can show them that there is a way through, but it can also oversimplify the reality of what that process is like. And I still have bad days, depending on what's happening in life. I still may struggle. I still may, wrestle with my own thoughts, but I've done the work. That's the key thing. I've done the work. The people in my life know where I'm at. They know my story. I'm not keeping anything hidden away. And that allows me to deal with stuff when it comes up.
I don't want to trivialize what you do, but do you get fatigue talking about it constantly? Is there a part of you that just wants to move on?
Yeah, totally. So a couple of months ago, I moved to London, and I'm splitting my time between London and New Zealand this year. And the reason that I've done that is that I want to be in a different environment. I think it's a really weird time for New Zealand. We can talk about that later. But I just wanted to be in a different environment. What I realized when I left journalism and I started speaking full time, mainly about mental health, is that I took off one mask and I put on another. So when I left journalism, I thought, I'm not this guy on TV anymore. I can still tell stories, but I don't have to perform in that way that I was doing for many years. But then I realized after another 3 years, I've just created a whole other persona, and that is the mental health guy. That is the guy who talks about this kind of stuff all the time. And there is fatigue that comes with that. Yeah. So I'm enjoying being in a different environment where I'm walking down the street and I'm not thinking about who am I going to bump into. I'm not thinking about what's the next thing that I need to post or what's the next piece of content that I need to create. I can actually learn to spend more time being comfortable in my own skin, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because one of the other things Tommy shared with us is your email, your contact details are in the book.
Yes.
Your inbox, it must be varying states of highest of highs and thank you so much, and I'm in the hole right now.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm going to do.
I get messages via email or just DMs on LinkedIn from people who say, I'm suicidal right now and I don't know what to do. People who pour out their entire life story. People who are just in really deep states of despair, and for some reason they've come across my story or something that I've said or shared about mental health, and so they think, I'll contact that guy. And I don't resent that at all. I think that's amazing. I mean, it's amazing that they trust me enough to reach out in that way. But at the same time, I'm not a counselor. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a mental health professional. I'm very clear to stay in my lane. And I try and direct people to services and support because they're the people that actually have the knowledge and the expertise to support them. But at the same time, often the reason people are getting in touch is because they haven't had the support and they can't find the support. So that's really tough. So what's my role? All I can do is encourage them and say, I see you, I recognize you, your life has value, your story has value, and try and be of encouragement to them. But I mean, I have had some amazing messages from people who, there's one person in particular who was close to ending their life. They had gone to the location where they were going to do it, and they had forgotten that they'd borrowed my book from the library, and they found the book in their bag, and they sat there and they read it, and they decided not to end their life. Wow. And so when you get an email and the subject line is, you saved my life, that's pretty humbling.
Man, that is so amazing. The mail we had on you is, you may be even underplaying it a little bit, is that the amount of mail you get and people stopping you on the street and unloading, and you're so generous with your time to all of them. And you've obviously got so much going on, which is, remarkable. But we're jumping all over the place, and I realize this is my doing, but bear with me. The decision to leave journalism and to link you up to what you're doing now, you decided that you just needed a break?
I'd taken 6 months of unpaid leave from TVNZ because I needed a circuit breaker.
I love that term, by the way.
Yeah.
Did you coin it or have you borrowed it?
I'm not the person who invented the whole word circuit breaker. I'm not the
First
first
time you've
person in
ever heard
history.
someone say circuit breaker.
In a mental well-being space, yes, it was.
But I'd gone on a holiday, and that was a circuit breaker because I'd taken, you take yourself out of your day-to-day work life, right? But I thought, well, no, I actually need a longer circuit breaker. I need to actually step away from my entire life. I need to walk out of it because this cycle that I'm in is not working for me. So I went to TVNZ and I said, can I please have 6 months of unpaid leave? And they were good enough to say yes. And they allowed me to go back to Wellington and just have that time out. And it was during that time and while writing the book that I realized, you know what? I'm actually done in Auckland and I'm going to resign.
Was writing the book the plan?
No, there was no plan to write a book. I've never wanted to write a book. I mean, writing 50,000 words is really hard. And where that came from was when I was in Auckland, I was sitting at my desk one afternoon. I vividly remember the day, and an email drops out of the sky into my inbox from the New Zealand publisher for HarperCollins, which is the international book publishing company. And he is talking about stories and books and whether I want to catch up with him. And I said, yeah, we interview authors on Sunday all the time. Just send me a list of what books you've got coming out. And he goes, no, I'm interested in whether you're writing a book. I thought, this is weird. Like, don't people have to try and negotiate book deals and write a manuscript and go and shop it around publishers? And I was depressed and suicidal. So writing a book was not at the top of my priority list. I just wanted to stay alive pretty much at that point. So I went and had a coffee with this guy, and he said, look, we're interested in your journalism. We like your storytelling. If you've got anything in the future, let us know. So I just parked that. And it was months later when I decided to take this break from TVNZ, moved back to Wellington, rented a tiny little apartment, and thought, well, what am I going to do for the next 6 months? And I thought, there's all these mental health books, and they're always written by someone who has come out the other side. It's always that I fell in a hole, I got out of a hole story. Why does no one ever write a book about a breakdown while they're in the middle of the breakdown? Now, it turns out that there's actually very good reasons why you shouldn't write a book about a breakdown while you're in a breakdown. But I didn't know that at the time. So I signed a publishing contract to write 50,000 words by the 6th of April, 2020. I had no idea what the book was going to be about, but I knew that it would be about me trying to figure my way out of this chaos that I was in mentally. And what I decided to do was the only thing that I knew and still know today, which is to use stories. So I went back and I re-interviewed dozens of people that I'd met as a journalist, people that I'd done stories on over the years. And I asked them to tell me how they had changed their own internal story. They couldn't change what had happened to them, what they'd lost, the pain that they'd been through, but they could change the story that explained who they were, where they'd come from, and where they were going in life. And I discovered that there's this whole field of research called narrative psychology, which is the psychological basis to how we tell stories about our lives. And the research shows that people who can tell more hopeful, helpful stories have lower rates of depression and anxiety, higher rates of self-esteem and life satisfaction, and they're also more likely to be generative, which means that they want to make a contribution to the world. So what I realized was I'd been trying all these other tools, but the tool that was under my nose the whole time was the power of storytelling. And that's what I decided to share with people through the book.
Do you remember, Shay, when you stopped drinking and we were having these conversations about changing your story? And let's just make your story. You're the guy that doesn't drink anymore.
Yeah. It's crazy,
awesome.
yeah. And that's what it was. It just, and it's come full circle where it's back on my consciousness again about, the story that you tell. And it was even more so after reading the book as well. It's like, man, I want to do a little bit more digging into kind of my background and my upbringing and my cultural references and how that influences me now. Was that painful for you to go through unpacking some of that stuff?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's hard to put your own stuff out there, but it's different when you're just sitting in your bedroom writing on a laptop. Like, you almost disassociate from the fact that thousands of people are going to read it, right? So I wrote this book and they designed the cover and everything, and then it gets to October in 2020, and I open the Weekend Herald on a Saturday morning, and there is my name and my face and a headline, which is a quote from me that says, "It was the perfect place to end my life." And they were publishing an excerpt from the book, which we had given them. and I knew what was going to be in it. I had written it. I'd written everything that was published in the Herald. But when you open the paper and you see those words attributed to you and you see your face, that's pretty confronting. And that was the moment that I realized the genie is out of the bottle now. There is no way that you can take this back. Once you put your story out there, you cannot take that back. And it was a reminder of what I'd learned over many years in journalism, which is that we ask for something huge of people when we give them the opportunity or we convince them to tell their story. That is a life-changing decision. And it's one that actually requires a lot of careful thought, really, to make sure, am I in the right place to do this? Is this really what I want to do? And why am I doing this? So I'd been through all of that, and I hoped that it would be helpful to people. And so I was like, cool, let's see what happens.
And you have now an incredible story to tell, everything we've just covered. Were you doing the Keynote stuff before you left journalism?
No.
Or was that was okay?
No.
What do I do now?
I left journalism and I had no idea what I was going to. I thought I would end up making little corporate videos for people. I just thought, you've left journalism, you're going to have to find something new to do. It's never going to give you the adrenaline rush or the satisfaction that you had from journalism, but that lifestyle isn't working for you. You can't stay in Auckland and you can't keep doing that. And so I thought I'd probably have to settle for something that was far more mediocre. But then I realized, well, why can't I use what I've learned, And I started talking to businesses and I realized that corporate training and development, the people that come into organizations and try and teach people about vulnerability and authenticity and workplace communication and empathy, that is a huge industry, right? Every day around the country, there are conferences, there are team days, there are leadership training things, there are off-sites, events in person and online where businesses are trying to upskill their people in the very areas and the very skills that I had spent 15 years trying to master. So I realized, okay, maybe my contribution in this space is not over. Maybe I can switch from telling other people's stories on their behalf to actually trying to teach people the skills that allow them to tell their own stories better. And that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years.
How many keynotes do you reckon you've done?
A few hundred.
A
few hundred. Usually I would do, the last few years I've done about 100 events a year.
And is it mostly the same thing, or you varying each one?
Yeah, so I started just telling my own story, right? Teaching people about narrative psychology and the power of storytelling and how they could change their own story. And then I realized that leadership storytelling is something that's lacking in a lot of our organizations. A lot of leaders feel that in order for them to seem trustworthy and credible, they can't be vulnerable. So then I built a leadership storytelling component. Then I realized that people were always complaining about the news and why the news was so negative and how hard it is to overcome the doom and gloom that's out there. So I built a keynote around news and information overload called Tell Me the Good News, about how you can find hope in all the negativity. And then COVID happened and everyone was talking about division in your workplace and how we're so polarized. We've never been more polarized on race, on climate change, on vaccination. So I built a keynote called Common Ground, which is about how do we find common ground with people who are different to us or people we disagree with. So that's it's just sort of evolved. There was never a grand plan to it.
Yeah, fuck, that's impressive. You're rolling that off like that's normal. That
if only there was awesome. Another speaking business you could join the book of.
But so now you've stepped out you've still kind of got, I know you're doing bits and pieces in journalism, yep. But you've got a good vantage point on what has happened and what's gone wrong and what perhaps the errors of the way that the sort of traditional media model went down. News Hub is, the news I'm sure we've all heard of the last couple of months of just redundancies everywhere and the walls are sort of falling in. What's your perspective on what they have done wrong and what they could do better?
I think it's incredibly sad, first of all, because what we're losing is the institutions that hold our culture together, really. We can all talk about how great Netflix is and how awesome it is to just sit on your laptop and watch content from all around the world. But we know from the data that local content is actually what resonates with people the most. Kiwis love seeing Kiwis on screen and hearing Kiwi stories. And when people say, oh, I don't watch TV anymore, I don't use New Zealand news, I just get it I get it from social media. It's like, well, who do you think created that content that's on social media, right? So there are no winners in this. But in terms of how we've ended up in this place, I think the main mistake that media organizations have made is that we didn't see the change coming fast enough in terms of the move to digital. We thought that linear TV, traditional TV, newspapers, magazines, etc., would hold on for probably another 10 to 15 years longer than they have. And all of a sudden, things have accelerated. And so, a new audience, a younger audience has come into the media environment, and they've said, we're not gonna stick around with these old forms of media. We want everything now. We want everything free. We want to customize it. We don't want to be told what to think. And in a nutshell, mainstream media, we haven't kept up with the pace of those changes.
Do you have thoughts about what shape our mainstream media will look like in the next 2, 5, 10 years?
Well, I mean, even in the next year, it's not going to look the same, right? Because we're looking at literally hundreds of job cuts in the next couple of weeks if Warner Brothers Discovery and TVNZ's plans go through. You're losing hundreds of collective years of journalism experience across all of the people that are going to lose their jobs. And I think it puts our country in a very precarious position. I mean, it's interesting, even the politicians that don't seem too fussed about this, when they're in opposition and they're trying to get people to cover their stories or cover their events, there's not going to be anybody to turn up. I mean, that's really what we're looking at. We're looking at like a bare bones news infrastructure that is probably largely funded or owned by the government, and not a huge diversity of voices or forms of content.
Yeah, it's. I've just left the Herald
Yes.
sport team after 12 years there, and redundancy sort of meetings every year, and thinking. I was having discussions before I left about trying to think about what the sport department looks like in a year. And it's hard. It's hard to imagine. There's so many pieces of it doing things which other news organisations are doing, and you're sort of doubling up. Even like the match report after a Super Rugby game or an All Blacks game, they're getting phased out because people have access to watch the highlights as soon as it's finished, or they're following it themselves.
Yeah.
So things which have been the anchor or sort of the prized pieces of that world for so long are now just seen as not that valuable anymore.
And I think one of the sad things as well is the loss of trust, right? And that was a huge issue during COVID. Media has always been a contentious industry. People would have always had strong views on the types of reporting that they were seeing, or whether it was, whether it was accurate or not. But over the years, particularly with social media, the boundaries have become blurred because journalists were no longer people who just told you the facts. Journalists became personalities. We were expected to build our own personal brands and build our social media presence and start to write columns and opinion pieces. Now, that stuff just wasn't even allowed when I started in journalism. There were opinion leaders, and there were columnists, and there were presenters and entertainers and stuff. And then journalists were sort of on the other side of the room. And so now what we've got is a public who don't necessarily trust where their information is coming from. And that's not the fault of the journalists, but it's partly the fault of the way that we've set our industry up, and how it works, and how many different hats people are wearing. And I think that's been a problem.
Yeah, what we have now is people trying to develop their own personal brands.
Yes.
And, again, the journalists that I work with, a big part of it is, well, let's blow up your profile more, because that is going to benefit you in the long term. You work in the space. Your personal brand is flying. Your LinkedIn profile, you're one of the best LinkedIn profiles in the game. You're doing it well. What advice do you have for people in that situation who are looking to build brand?
Well, the first piece of advice would be to be clear on what your content is for and who it's for. I think there's so many people even on LinkedIn now who are like, here's the formula, right? Here's how you write a post. Here's how you optimize engagement. There's now a rewrite with AI button that LinkedIn has built into the posting function, where you literally press a button and it will rewrite the entire post that you're about to post to try and make it more, engagement friendly. And all of that stuff is fine, but I think people lose their unique voice when they're too fixated on their audience, or how many likes it's going to get, or how many comments it's going to get. I mean, for me, if you want to be another pretentious term, thought leader, which is pretty much what people want to be on LinkedIn, right? They want people to be following them because of their thoughts and their ideas and their insights. Be clear on what value you can add to people's lives, Look at the content that's out there and ask yourself, what can I say that people are not saying right now? During COVID, one of my most shared and liked posts ever was the day that we switched to the red setting because Omicron had arrived in our community. And I went on LinkedIn and I realized that no one was posting, right? There was like no comment. And it was because everyone was probably running around with their heads on fire trying to work out what they needed to do in their businesses or how they needed to respond. So I put on a blazer and I walked down to my local cafe on Cuba Street, and I knew which table I was going to sit at. I bought a flat white and I sat there and I took a selfie and I wrote this post that started with the words, "Hey Kiwis, just remember New Zealand is not in lockdown." And you might remember that at that point, a lot of us kind of went back to an old level 4 mindset. It was like we were back in lockdown and people started going back into their houses and saying, I'm not going to go out and spend money. I'm not going to go to the movies. I'm not going to see anybody for the next few months. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We actually now have a whole range of health tools that allow us to be out and carry on with a kind of normal life that's as normal as possible for us. And that post was, it reached 1 million people's timelines. Now, what was unique about that insight? Not a lot, right? It was a photo of me sitting outside a cafe, just reminding people that we weren't in level 4, but it went off. So often I think the stuff that resonates is when you can actually touch on something that other people are feeling or thinking, but no one's said out loud.
Yeah, that AI scene is going to be really interesting. Shay called me out on it. I sort of rewrote something for our website, and there's these phrases that keep popping up. It's like beacon of hope. Or something. It's like, bro, did you chat GPT this one? It's like, oh.
Yeah, busted.
You got me. This has been epic. Like I've just been so transfixed on it. But sort of getting towards the end, and the decision to move to London, which was earlier this
a couple of months ago.
Yep. So what's the reason?
Well, I've had the privilege of traveling around the country for the last few years speaking, and I've heard a lot of great speakers. I've emceed a lot of great conferences. I've listened to pretty much everyone, and also with my journalism hat on, I've interviewed pretty much everyone in New Zealand that I could want to interview. And what I realized is if I want to keep doing this, if I want to keep contributing to some of the big conversations that we're having in Aotearoa, I need to get out of this environment for a bit, because New Zealand is an incredibly small place and we can be an echo chamber and we can all pat ourselves on the back and tell ourselves that we have, the best ideas and the right perspectives on stuff. But there's a big wide world out there where there's lots of people, millions and millions of people wrestling with the same problems that we are wrestling with. There are different perspectives, there's different cultural approaches, there's different ideas, there's different solutions. And so I thought the right decision would be to put myself in London. Now, people have said to me, hang on a second, you think New Zealand's got problems and you're going to put yourself in London?
Yeah.
And my answer to that is I'm not invested in the future of Europe, but I'm deeply invested in the future of New Zealand. So I care about what's happening here, but I also know that there's a lot that I can learn and we can learn from what's happening overseas. And I wanted to have a bit of an OE, and lots of my friends are in the UK at the moment. So what I'm doing is I'm sort of splitting my time between New Zealand and London. I'm back here for blocks of speaking and events every couple of months, and we'll see what the rest of the year holds in London itself.
In that time period, have you picked up any major differences or any glaring differences between there and here?
I think my main observation is that New Zealand is going through an identity crisis. I was searching for what's the word or what's the phrase that explains the vibe in New Zealand right now. And the best words that I can use are identity crisis. For generations, we had a very clear, simple, coherent story about what New Zealand was and who we are as a people. And that story was number 8 wire, plucky Kiwi battlers, at the bottom of the world, clean and green, 100% pure, nuclear-free New Zealand, the country that produced everything from Lord of the Rings to Flight of the Conchords. We all understood what that was, right? We knew what that looked like in business, in politics, in culture. We were able to exploit that. We could take it to the world, and the world absolutely loved it. Something switched during COVID. And it wasn't just COVID that caused it, but we've probably had many, many years where we've been smugly sitting in this idea that we're ahead of the rest of the world and aren't we so progressive, and look at Trump Isn't that, stupid Americans? Look at Brexit, stupid Brits. Look at how they're trashing their countries, right? And we have it all figured out. And during COVID, we realized we actually don't have it all figured out. And the issues that the rest of the world have been wrestling with have now come and landed on our doorstep. We have populist politics. We have a level of divisiveness that we've never seen before. We are, our growth is being outstripped by other economies. China has obviously been rising for a couple of decades. India is now going off the charts. Where do we fit in all of this? And so at the moment, I don't think we have the leadership from any political party or really any sort of sector in the business community to say, look, this is the vision. This is where we're going as a country. This is where we need to be putting our money. This is the direction. Instead, I think we're just fighting fires. But what makes me incredibly hopeful is that people are hungry for good stories right now. They are hungry for people who can say, here is some hope and some optimism, and this is the direction that we can go in as a country. So hopefully I can play a small part in that.
That might be the most comprehensive answer to what are the differences between London and New Zealand that I've ever heard.
And it's colder.
Yeah. Would that, when I hear you answer that, like I've witnessed through this whole interview, 34, I can't believe you're 34. You know so much. You're
How
so
old are
worldly.
you?
38.
Yeah. So
Let's
you've
not
got
play
4
that game.
years
Let's
on
not
me.
play that game.
But what I was going to ask is, is politics, is
No.
that an avenue that you would
No.
go into?
No, never in a million years. I would never be able to put my allegiance is not the right word. Sounds like something out of Lord of the Rings. Give my allegiance to one party and say, I'm going to go out and toe the party line on every issue. That is what you sign up to when you become a politician. You lose the ability to think, to use your own brain in many ways, because your job is to go out there and sell the manifesto that your party has agreed to. And look, in every party, and this is an interesting point, I can see parts of every single party's policies that I love and endorse and agree with, and I can also see stuff that I detest and think is just plain stupid. And I think one of the problems is we love putting people into boxes, right? Like a lot of people would look at my reporting over the years and think, oh, a lot of that's really, left wing, bleeding heart, socially, progressive stuff. And I get emails from people saying that. And then I also get emails from people who tell me that I'm like severely right wing. And any journalist that you talk to will tell you that they get emails from both sides of the political spectrum. I think that we need to get much better at having nuanced conversations around politics and around issues, but actually our political system is not set up like that. It's set up as an adversarial one side versus the other, and that's what contributes to some of the stuff that we've talked about.
Man, real knowledge bombs being dropped there. Come to talk.
He's not in. Look, I know you got to go. I've just got a couple of little bits on my list that I'm keen to touch on. Male body image.
Just drop that one in there.
Male body image. Yeah. What are we?
Just a statement.
What are we?
What about it?
What are we doing? Are we
What are we
good? Are
doing?
we in a good place?
I think we're in a different place than where we were. I just remember growing up feeling incredibly insecure about my body because I didn't play sport. I was not good at sport. I was incredibly skinny, like really, really skinny. And this was the era in which, Dan Carter was in his jockeys on every single billboard. We had a very one-dimensional view of what masculinity was meant to look like from a physical perspective. And in New Zealand, that's always been the farmy, rugby type of image. And it's interesting now because you think about, well, who are the people that we see? People like Timothée Chalamet or Tom Holland. I mean, these are some of the biggest male celebrities of the next generation that's come through. But it wasn't like that when I was growing up. And I struggled. I mean, it was sort of woven into this self-loathing or self-hatred that I had, which contributed to a lot of my mental health stuff. I just didn't like myself and I didn't like my body. And that was part of that.
The way you wrote about that in the book as well was really thought-provoking. As someone who's on the biggest scale of things, that also has their own male body image issues, of always never looking at the other side of the coin and thinking that someone might be envious of a situation that I had going on.
Yeah.
It's wild to think that there are two sides to that
And when
coin.
you're really skinny, people are much more comfortable to make overt comments about your weight than I think they would if they had perceived that you were overweight. Because it's like, oh, you're skinny, like you've got no problems. Like surely that's what, you know,
you
that's
can eat
what
what you want.
You can eat what you want. So yeah, that was something that I struggled with. And I first wrote about it in my early 20s. And I literally had men in their 50s coming up to me on the street saying, thank you so much for writing about this. This is something that I've always struggled with. So yeah.
A lot of validation, a lot of good validation across your body of work.
I just think that the more that we can have some of those conversations, I mean, when we have a conversation like that, what we're doing is we're giving other people permission. And it took me years to realize that. It's like, well, why are people responding like this? Why is this such a big deal for them? It's because, and of course they did have permission, but they didn't feel like they did. They felt that they needed someone else to come along and say, oh, it's actually okay to struggle with this, and it's okay to talk about this.
Do you keep rewriting your narrative?
Yeah. Your narrative is not fixed, right? So the story of your life, and this is the beauty of it, the story of your life is constantly in draft form. And I think many people, when they think about their life story, they imagine it's in black and white or it's on a stone tablet, like this is the story, this is the version of the story that's true versus a version that's not true. But the way that I like to think about it is this helpful or is it not helpful? You know, like the three of us could each go through exactly the same trauma or tragedy or experience in life. But what defines us is not the experience itself, it's how we choose to interpret it. What is the story that I'm going to tell about what happened and how it changed me and what it means for my future? So the great thing is, no matter what you're going through or the hard stuff that's going to come around the corner, you're always the author of your own story. And that's my goal. That's my mission. Like my dream is that every young person in New Zealand grew up with some form of education in this area that helped them to realize that you're the author, you're the author, you're the author. You can't change the circumstances, but you're the author. What's the story that you're going to tell today?
It's so empowering to take some of those ideas away from the book and then implement them into your life. Like even in the last 48 hours, man, I'm like there's a fucking rush of, I don't know, perspective's not the right word, but like optimism about actually that stuff that did happen then, how do you just reframe it? How do you look at it and use it as fuel to continue your progress? Yeah,
and I think the only caveat to that is that this is not about just a bit of positive psychology, you know, pull up your bootstraps and slap a smile on your face. You know, trauma is trauma, pain is pain. And for a lot of people, they will live with scars that will never fully heal, right? So we've got to be careful that we don't put pressure on people to just, you know, be a little bit more hopeful or find, you know, some sort of Pollyanna meaning in the tough stuff that's happened in their life. My point is your story serving you? You know, the version of the story that you're telling yourself, is this actually working for you? Is it helping you to move through what you've been through? Is it propelling you into the next chapter of your life? Or are you stuck? Are you holding on to a version of that story that's actually trapping you in a place that you actually don't want to be? That's the way that I frame that up.
I've heard you say that you don't like goals, and I've heard you say that you don't like looking more than 1 year in advance.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a tough one for you to answer. But is on what you've just said, is the idea just to keep growing the platform as big as possible to help influence and help people and spread your message? Is that the big picture?
I don't know what the answer to that question is yet. And I guess the season of life that I'm in is trying to work that out. What do I actually want my impact to be? One of the things that I've always found useful, and if you're someone who gets asked to do a lot of stuff, as many people listening to this probably are, how do you work out what to say no to? And I've always struggled with that because I feel like, well, I'm being given an opportunity. I can probably help people or do something good through this. I should probably say yes. But one of the criteria that I've developed for myself is, if I don't do this, what is the consequence? Like what's the actual consequence of me saying no to this thing? And usually the answer is, well, they'll just get someone else to do it.
Yeah.
And that to me was a massive light bulb moment. And it came from being asked to fly down to Christchurch on a Saturday to MC a big black tie gala for a charity, for a fundraising thing. Like, really great cause, something that I would have been more than happy to be part of. But I was like, it's on a Saturday. I've been away twice already this week. this is what it's going to cost me in terms of time, well-being, rest, all the rest of it. What's going to happen if I say no? And they're like, they'll ring one of the next 5 people on their list, right? So what I'm trying to do is go, well, where am I actually making a difference? So if I say no to that, there's actually going to be a loss, or the person that's going to do that, or it's not going to happen, or the person that's going to do that isn't going to be able to share the message that I can share that particular audience needs to hear, then I'll go, yep, I'm going to do that. But in terms of a long-term plan, what am I going to be doing a year or 5 years from now? I'm not sure. But I definitely want to keep telling stories in some form.
Same.
Great.
Same.
Great.
Hey, I had really high expectations for this one, and that is delivered. It's been so, man, this has been such a cool let. Before I throw to Shay, who's going to do the big
Don't say that. Don't say that.
No, I'm building you up, man.
No, because I haven't got
some,
anything.
I know you've got something. I know you'll be able to pull
I've written
it out.
story. That's all I've written.
I've had a really enjoyable week reading the book, a little bit each night, but I highly recommend going out and checking it out. This is not how it ends. I really enjoyed talking to Tommy and getting that perspective of you and your journalism trailblazing path, and what you're doing now is really cool. So I look forward to following your adventures. The best LinkedIn poster in the game. Well, actually, you and Jesse Mulligan, I gave him props on this. Anyway.
Yeah,
Nice.
Anyway, I'm rambling. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for your
It's been a
time.
really cool experience. But Shay, wrap us up.
I don't know how to wrap us up other than often people come into this podcast, and I don't know whether it's me adjusting the narrative to suit the message that I'm hearing. And we got accused of knob polishing Guy Montgomery, and I feel like all I've done today is polish your knob. And I make no bones about that, because, like, for me personally, it's just been so incredible to read and to resonate and to feel like I understand. And I feel like sometimes on my own journey, I didn't feel understood. So to see those words and those ideas leap out and like smack you in the face is a really uplifting experience. I hope as many young people as possible get their hands on that bit of material, because I feel like it can equip them much, much better for the world that we're living in at the moment. We posed the question earlier about like masculinity and what that looks like. I feel like you, not blowing smoke up your ass, but an amazing embodiment of what that is, and being so comfortable now with who they are. I think that's a really powerful thing to take away, and something that I'm definitely going to take away from this conversation today, as well as hoping that we can be friends.
We can be friends, Seamus.
Amazing.
We can absolutely be friends. Thanks so much for having me and for your awesome questions.
Cheers, Jehan.
Cheers.